War and civil unrest turn soldiers, and often civilians, into deliberate targets. Medical professionals have an ethical duty to provide care and treatment to those in need without discrimination, even in times of conflict. But during conflict and civil unrest, healthcare professionals, facilities, and patients too often come under attack. These attacks are not a natural part of conflict, but are deliberate violations of the principle of medical neutrality. Medical neutrality requires non-interference with medical services and special protection for medical care, professionals, and facilities. During times of armed conflict, for example, warring factions must protect civilians, allow wounded civilians and combatants to receive care regardless of affiliation, and refrain from interfering with medical personnel, facilities, and transport. The principle of medical neutrality, which applies during peacetime as well as conflict, has a strong foundation in medical ethics and international law, including international human rights law and the laws of war. Violations of medical neutrality include militarized attacks on healthcare facilities, deliberate blocking of access to medical treatment and supplies, punishment of healthcare professionals who provide care to those in need, and the destruction of medical facilities, records, or supplies. These attacks have the compound effect of impeding access to healthcare for those in need.
When governments or armed groups attack physicians, hospitals, disrupt medical supply chains, or attack ambulances, what they're doing is multiplying the effect of their force on civilians. So, for example, a physician may treat as many as 40 or 50 or more patients in a day when working in a conflict zone. When that physician is killed or harmed, that not only endangers that physician's life, it endangers the lives of everyone that physician would be taking care of.
Physicians for Human Rights has investigated violations of medical neutrality over more than 2 decades.
In the last few decades, we've seen a distressing erosion of the fundamental principle of neutrality that protects the delivery of health care and those who deliver it during times of conflict. In Panama during the 1980s, the government harassed, intimidated, arrested, and tortured health professionals who spoke out against the deteriorating health system there. After civilian demonstrations there in 1987, the government blocked access to injured civilians who were trying to get into hospitals. During the Civil War in El Salvador, the protection that should have been afforded to health workers was repeatedly violated, and hospitals were attacked, sometimes bombed, and health workers were assaulted, arrested, and frequently tortured, and sometimes actually executed. During Somalia's civil war, the Red Cross actually had to put signs up in front of the hospital begging the rebels and other militias not to bring guns inside the hospital. One of the most serious incidents in the history of violations of medical neutrality occurred during the wars in former Yugoslavia, where the Yugoslav National Army overran the Red Cross and entered the Vukovar hospital, removing more than 200 patients, putting them in trucks, lining them up at the side of the road, and executing them. The dead included hospital staff and victims with IV lines and casts. When Physicians for Human Rights exhumed the grave for the criminal tribunal, we found surgical implements in the grave.
Violations of medical neutrality are not limited to one region or moment in time, as is evident in the recent uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa.
The Arab Spring hit Bahrain in the middle of February, and there were hundreds of thousands of civilian protesters, unarmed, who took to the streets. And the government response was brutal and systematic. They shot and detained people, they tortured them while in prison, and then the doctors, the Bahraini physicians who tended to them, who took care of their injuries and wounds in the hospitals and clinics, they themselves became the target of the government security forces. they were then systematically targeted, arrested in the middle of the night, taken out of their hospital workplaces, taken out of surgery even, detained and disappeared. They were held incommunicado by these security forces in Bahrain. And then while in police custody earlier this year, they were tortured themselves. And this is what Physicians for Human Rights investigated several months ago. Physicians for Human Rights has also been working to document similar systematic attacks against doctors and nurses and hospitals in other countries, for example, Syria and Libya.
All governments have an obligation to protect the principle of medical neutrality and to ensure that individuals have access to healthcare services.
There are things that we can do. The US government can pass the Medical Neutrality Protection Act as a matter of foreign policy. The bill would protect those providing medical services to those in need. The international community could urge the United Nations to create the position of a special rapporteur on medical neutrality that would chronicle and document international violations of medical neutrality.
Medical neutrality must be protected, promoted, and preserved. Learn more and take action at medicalneutrality.org.